This is Dr. Josie Valderrama, mindfulness psychologist. In this first of a series of lectures, I will be talking about the dialectical perspective, as well as introducing concepts from acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy, and also discussing the flow state. So what is a dialectical perspective? It simply means that a healthy, balanced approach to living encompasses not just one right way, but a mixture of opposing forces, so that what may be right in one situation may be the opposite of what is most helpful in another situation. This is why mindfulness comes into play, because we need to begin to assess in the moment what are the parameters we're dealing with, what may be excessive, and what is lacking. The dialectical perspective is symbolized best and most succinctly by the yin-yang symbol, so that it's a mixture of polarities to create wholeness, darkness and light, positive and negative. And so when we look at the dialectical perspective in terms of mindfulness, one of the key components is metacognition. Metacognition is simply the practice of observing your own thoughts. Meta meaning above, so above your thoughts. And I just wanted to read a quote from an interview with an actress, Emily Browning, where she talks about metacognition. This is from The Guardian. So she says, "I learned a word the other day, metacognition, which is to have awareness and understanding of your own thought process. I think about what I'm thinking about on a constant loop until I feel like my brain is eating itself. If it is still for too long, that's what it feels like. Falling into a black hole in my own head. When I'm in front of the camera, that's the only time I really get release. I'm just there." So this is Emily Browning, and the context of this quote is she was talking about being a very anxious person. And I thought it was really striking because this is an example of how terms like metacognition can be introduced to the general public, and yet there can be a misunderstanding of the definition. Metacognition is a part of mindfulness where you are observing your thoughts, but it isn't that kind of reflexive, compulsive watching of your thoughts that can take place in a state of anxiety, for instance, where we begin to worry about our worrying, and we can't seem to get out of that. When we are in states like that, we are very fused. We're very cognitively fused with the thoughts, meaning we don't have a sense of emotional non-attachment from the thoughts. It's almost like we're stuck inside the thoughts, right? But true mindful metacognition is cognitively defused. That means there's distance from the thoughts. We are able to see the thoughts almost as if in third person, like hovering above the thoughts. And we're able to have a sense of non-attachment, sort of dispassion about the situation. Not a sort of clinical coldness, but just a curiosity about it. Not being flooded with emotions about it, not having reactive mind, right? So what is the difference between what Emily Browning described as metacognition and true metacognition? The main difference is the level of attachment that the observer is having to the thought that they're observing. So when you're very attached, you're overly attached to the thoughts, you feel like you're stuck inside the thoughts, fused with the thoughts, then that is not metacognition. You are in a state of cognitive fusion. If you are observing the thoughts and you are able to hold these distressing thoughts, if they're distressing, but at the same time have a sense of psychological distance from the thoughts, almost as if you were observing the thoughts in another person, then that is metacognition. So it's something that comes with practice through meditation and other mindfulness practices. So another interesting part of Ms. Browning's quote was about her finding refuge through performance. And I did want to touch upon this because this is the other topic that I'm going to talk about today, and that is the flow state. The flow state, which is a theory that has been put forth by a psychologist, Mihaly Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. A mouthful of a name, but it's a great theory about how we enter into the flow state, the zone, the state of mastery, right? And I believe that that's what she's talking about when she talks about this feeling of release and freedom that she has in front of the camera, away from anxiety. So I'm going to just put that on the table for now, but we're going to talk about that later. And I believe that this is a very important state that approaches such as acceptance and commitment therapy, which move you towards psychological flexibility, really are about engendering more and more potential to be in the flow state. So, when we're looking at the dialectical experience and a dialectical approach to life, a balance of opposing forces, not being just one way, right? It's really about not doing any sort of shortcut thinking in the moment, not just memorizing some dogma or some instructions and then going on autopilot. When we go on autopilot, that is the opposite of mindfulness. And that's really what gets us in trouble in life, is when we're sort of checked out and we're sort of lost in our heads, lost in our storylines, and we're not really seeing what's right in front of us, right? And we often do this because, on some conscious or unconscious level, we don't want to see what's in front of us, and that's a form of experiential avoidance. And at other times, it's just too painful because we're flooded with emotion, and that's the cognitive fusion. And experiential avoidance and cognitive fusion are considered the two main forms of suffering within the acceptance and commitment therapy orientation within that body of research. And in fact, the studies around ACT are saying that about 25% of all mental health disorders have the underlying factor of experiential avoidance. So people attempting to avoid painful or uncomfortable experiences, whether it's an actual experience of like a social anxiety, which we know is reinforced by isolation, right? This is how this is the vicious cycle of anxiety. Is anxiety makes us want to avoid situations or whatever it is that's causing us anxiety, but that actually reinforces the anxiety. This is why with phobias, the treatment is exposure. Expose yourself to that which you fear, either little by little or flooding, and you will eventually overcome that fear because you'll see that there's nothing really to be afraid of. We're talking about false threats here, right? Things that are disproportionate in our heads in terms of the reality of the situation. So experiential avoidance is a big one, but it's not just avoiding concrete things. It can be avoiding certain thoughts, particularly thoughts that lead to underlying beliefs that we hold about ourselves, that we're afraid to face because they're painful. Often thoughts about our unworthiness, our fundamental unworthiness, or that we're undeserving or damaged. And it's my belief that we all have inherent worth, but the fact is the definition of a belief is that we believe it. So therefore, that's why it's so powerful and so difficult to face, because we really believe it's true, and therefore it becomes this constant thing to try to run away from it. But it's like a dog trying to run away from its own tail. It's attached to us. It is our belief. So the only way to dissipate it is to face it and to, uncover evidence, reality check basically, to see, is this actually true? And then to begin to replace it with healthier and more realistic beliefs, right? So that experiential avoidance can be a simple thing where when something causes us to touch upon a belief that is scary within us, we'll immediately change the subject. We might not even notice. We may reach for something to blot out the feeling, to induce pleasure in us. So, addictions often come about from experiential avoidance. So much of life's suffering comes from this, right? And our ego is often tied into it too, because our ego is quite fragile and wants to believe certain things about itself, and it will use experiential avoidance to to stop our growth, really. So getting our egos in check, having our egos serve us instead of us serving our egos is really the proper perspective, right? And so now I wanted to talk a little bit about neuro-linguistic programming. NLP, it's something I'm certified in, and it's really interesting as a psychologist, because it's not anything that we were taught in in my clinical training, and if you go to the Wikipedia page for neurolinguistic programming, they call it a pseudoscience. And yet, because I have studied psychology and I've studied Ericksonian hypnotherapy and Virginia Satir, when I took neurolinguistic programming and became a certified practitioner, I saw that the entire basis for this approach is Ericksonian hypnotherapy. I'd say about 85%, and then the rest is Virginia Satir's model of family therapy. And those are the two bases for NLP. So my question is to the people who keep changing the Wikipedia page to NLP being a pseudoscience, how can NLP be a pseudoscience when it's based on tried and true psychological theories that are used within APA clinical psychology schools? Ericksonian hypnotherapy, which is approved by the American Medical Association, the APA, on, and then Virginia Satir, who's considered one of the most brilliant family therapists out there in terms of the techniques that she pioneered. So, but the reason why I'm bringing up NLP is I'm giving an example of the dialectical perspective at work within an entire approach to personal growth. So here's the interesting thing with NLP is these two models that NLP is based on are actually completely opposite. And yet either one or the other is used in any given situation depending on the practitioner's perception of what is needed. Now, the Milton model, as they call it, that's what they call the Ericksonian hypnotherapy model, is a model that is all about the big picture, right? It endeavors to expand and elevate the perspective to a scale more inclusive, less differentiated, using hypnotic language that is open-ended and purposefully ambiguous in order to induce a trance state in which the individual subject can access their own unconscious or higher consciousness and the wisdom therein. So that really is how the Milton model works, how Ericksonian hypnotherapy works, right? And then there's the other model, which is the Virginia Satir model. And forgive me, but I off the top of my head, there is a specific name that they call the model in NLP, and it's not the Satir model because that's a separate model in family therapy. But this other model is the opposite. It's a drill down model. It utilizes focused questions to drill down and get more specific with the goal of removing blind spots in the individual's consciousness and gaining clarity by replacing fuzzy thinking with lucid trains of thought, which include points of reference, attributions, delineated causality, and awareness of the lack thereof. So really, these two approaches within one system of self-help or personal growth or coaching are being utilized. And so it's just an example of how two seemingly paradoxical techniques can complement one another. It really just depends on what is needed in the moment in order to induce greater awareness and positive change. So these two systems, are just demonstrate how in any given moment you can't be rigid about what your approach is going to be. An example, sort of a illustration I like to think of is if you're dipping a cup into a river, the water that you're getting in that cup is going to be different from moment to moment because the river is flowing and our life is flowing. The contents of our life are constantly dynamically shifting. And so, that is why in any given moment, we cannot just say, oh, well, of course I need to do this. We actually need to check in a very mindful way and really assess, well, what are the parameters of the situation in this very moment, not what I'm projecting out, and not what was there a few moments ago, but in this very moment. So now I want to talk about metacognition as an aspect of mindfulness, and really just segueing into a big picture, quick overview of the hexaflex model of acceptance and commitment therapy. And I will talk more about this in a future lecture, but I just want to quickly go over it so that you get a sense of what this is about. So mindfulness does not equal metacognition. Metacognition is an aspect of mindfulness, but it is not the only aspect of mindfulness. It's one component. So within the ACT model, you have self as context, which is like a fancy word for the observing self. That is the one who watches your own thoughts, right? You're thinking, and then you can watch your own thoughts. So you are both the watcher and the doer. And then also present moment awareness. So simply being in the present moment. The present moment being our point of power. So the present moment awareness, it often involves a somatic attunement, getting connected with your breath, with, the rise and fall of your abdomen, ribs, and chest as the rhythm of your breath or your pulse or other inner rhythms, the feel of your feet on the ground and your body in the chair. These are a way to get grounded into the present moment and out of your head, right? So there is a sort of, even within that model of self as context and present moment awareness, there's sort of a dialectical process going on there, because the self as context is that metacognition. It's using your brain to observe itself. So it's sort of very head focused. But the present moment awareness is getting out of your head, sinking into your body and, finding that sense of presence through a very sensory, almost primal connection. So in that way, those two aspects of mindfulness can encompass a dialectical perspective. Once you begin searching for dialectical perspectives, you can see them in many places, and you can see how they work off each other. And the reason why that's helpful is because when you're lacking balance, instead of asking, what is the thing I'm not doing, you can begin to see what is the equation that needs balancing, and what are the two sides of the equation, and which side of the equation might I need to move towards, and which side might I need to move away from, right? So it's just a more nuanced way of getting balanced. Now, getting back to the acceptance and commitment therapy model, when we have this process of present moment awareness, of self as context, there is paradox within that. There is the alignment with being above our thoughts, as well as the alignment with being in our body. So, as I mentioned before, there's that paradox, right? Now, I also mentioned before, ACT considers the two main causes of suffering to be experiential avoidance and cognitive fusion. So, two things that ACT emphasizes as positive components, which are also on the ACT model, hexaflex. And hexaflex is just this term they use for the structure of their model, which is like shaped like a star. And I'll get into this more in another lecture. But so diffusion is another point, fundamental principle in ACT. So that is non-judgment, a healthy non-attachment, getting that distance from the thoughts, right? And then acceptance. Acceptance is not fighting reality. It is simply surrendering to what is, Now, what is the difference between acceptance and, for instance, something like apathy, right? Well, that's where some of the other main principles of ACT come in. For instance, values exploration, right? Values are very important in ACT because that's a way for you to steer the direction you want to go in, to ground your self-discovery and growth and relationship building and ambitions within concepts that have meaning to you, bringing meaning to your life, right? So that's one way that acceptance doesn't just turn into apathy, right? And then acceptance can sometimes be a touchy or triggering concept because people feel that they need to be not accepting of anything in their life that is that they just don't find acceptable, right? So one of the things we need to think about, though, is there are steps in order to get to the place you need to get to. If it was as simple as saying, okay, I know where I need to go, snap my fingers and get there, then we wouldn't need psychology, really, right? But so what we've discovered is that there really needs to be a lot of acceptance and associated with that compassion, self-compassion, in order to create space for this change to happen, to get to where you know you want to go, right? They've done studies that show that self-compassion is much more effective than self-esteem exercises in terms of actual performance. And why would that be? If you sit in a room and you tell yourself, I can, and you give yourself affirmations, versus you sit in a room and you tell yourself, it's okay just the way you are, you're doing really good, and and it's not always easy, and just sort of holding yourself emotionally, like you're soothing a crying baby, right? They found when they test these experimental participants in some sort of performative test, the ones that were tasked with self-compassion did much better. So there's a sense of not needing to crack the whip on ourselves, but creating less pressure so that our natural ability to perform is able to come through, right? And so that's where the sense of not needing to control things too much comes in, not over-controlling, right? And so we integrate. It's not all about, for instance, when we have a certain thought that perhaps we're not happy that we've had this thought, and we think that we should just try to stop this thought. Perhaps you're a parent and you realize you have a thought that your child is annoying. Your child annoys you sometimes, right? And you tell yourself, well, I'm a horrible parent. I can't have this thought that my child's annoying me. Right? So then you are beginning this process of trying to repress this thought. You're trying to defy that thought. And you're not allowed to have that thought, right? And what this does is it creates an energy of resistance and repression, because we've labeled this thought as evil and unacceptable, and we're judging it. And that creates a whole sort of dynamic that it's almost like the negativity accretes. It's like a little piece of sand, in an oyster, and then it creates a pearl. But this pearl you don't want, okay? Because what's happening is all of that negativity, that thought is happening for a reason. Our thoughts and our feelings happen for a reason. We need to have awareness of them and acknowledge them so we can process that information that it's trying to transmit to us. If we deny that processing of the information, it will simply continue to haunt us, right? So instead of trying to repress it and judge it as bad, we simply need to see it for what it is and hold it with compassion that we are having that thought. And if we can trace the thread back to the emotions and beliefs behind that and understand, what is it that I must be believing about myself or this situation right now that is causing me to feel this way, right? So we'll actually have more freedom and more ability to shift out of those thoughts if we give them breathing room to express themselves, to convey to us whatever information that needs to be conveyed. Okay, so getting back to the ACT model, We talked about self as context, present moment awareness, diffusion, acceptance. I touched upon values a bit and the importance of values to bring meaning to your life. You know, after we have diffusion and acceptance, the question of how do we move, you know, we need a compass. That's where the values comes in, right? And then with the values and everything else in our toolbox, we then can create committed action towards our goals. And I would add, at the end of that whole process, you then can move into the flow state. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the flow state, which I've diagrammed right here, this handy diagram for you. Okay, that didn't help. But okay, so this is my diagram. This is the diagram of the flow state. And I think it's really interesting to look at it because we can learn a lot from all the different aspects that come into play around the flow state, so that when we find ourselves in these other states, which we just tend to label as bad, we can understand in what relation they are to the actual zone that we would like to get into, the zone of mastery, right? The flow state. So if we look at this diagram, along this axis is skill level. So low skill over here, and then it moves this way to high skill, right? And then along this axis is challenge. So this is low challenge, and this is high challenge. So you can see what we have here. When you have low skills and low challenge, you have apathy because you don't have the tools and nothing challenging is happening anyway, so you don't really care. All right, now if you have some skills but no challenge still, you're just bored. And if you have high skills and low challenge, you're relaxed. You know, it's cool. So then if you have low skills with medium challenge, that's when you start to worry. You know, you just maybe a little bit over your head and it's starting to stress you out. And if you've got high skills with medium challenge, you have a sense of control. You're like, okay, this is good. I got this under control. If you've got low skills and high challenge, you're starting to get anxious. This is just, it's starting to feel like an emergency. You're juggling and you're not catching all the balls, right? And then if you've got medium skills and high challenge, this is a state of arousal. You're pretty amped up, the adrenaline's pumping, and you're really trying, right? Now, here's the sweet spot. This is flow. So you have high skill and high challenge. You've got all the tools to get the job done, and you also are in a highly challenging environment that's really, you know, getting you to compete on the highest level of your abilities. And that's where you're going to have flow. So you can see how this works. If it starts to be too challenging for your skill level, then you might shift into more arousal. You might start to feel just sort of manic about things. And if it starts to be a little less challenging, then you know, you might just slip into just a sense of control, and you know, you can slip into these others depending on, you know, how the challenge is relative to your skill level. Okay, so this flow state is a state that, you know, we all want to achieve, whether we're playing sports or performing in some other way, doing something creative, even, you know, just in a social engagement, whatever it may be, right? So the flow state is one that people look for and get a lot of gratification from. And I believe through our psychological flexibility, by working through you know, practices like acceptance commitment therapy, we can get ourselves into a flow state more often. Now, I want to talk about the theory of flow and the description that the psychologist Michele Csikszentmihalyi, what he has to say about flow. So flow usually occurs during an action state with intrinsic motivation. That is one primarily compelled by an inner drive rather than external rewards. So you're doing something for its own sake, for the joy of it. And things like outside validation and even learning are secondary to just the feeling of joy and bliss that you're getting from it, right? And the theory postulates three conditions. One, that there's a clear set of goals and progression. So a direction in which you can point your arrow, and then also some way of measuring your progress, right? So that's the first postulate. The second is that there's clear and immediate feedback so that you can analyze and recalibrate accordingly. And the third is a sense of confidence. So there's a balance between your skillfulness and the challenge. Hard, but not too hard, right? And so what might get in the way of all of these three conditions being met in order for the flow state to happen? Well, with the first state of a clear set of goals and a progression, you may not know what you need in terms of what goal is the goal that you should be working on, right? Sometimes that is the problem, is you don't know how to get into this flow state because you're not exactly sure what you're trying to accomplish in the first place, right? So how do you figure that out? One of the things is to pin down your values, right? Maybe you're not getting into a flow state when you're trying to do something because you don't really even value what you're doing. Maybe it's someone else's goal, not your own. So your parents, your society, your partner. Maybe there's a sense of indecisiveness based on your own fears, or a sense of anxiety about options closing off, just a fuzziness about your values. And in addition, there can be a sense that there isn't a good benchmark, a good way to assess, whether you're on track or off track. If you're missing the odometer and the lines to follow on the road, then how are you supposed to get there, right? So this is all of these, I'll just say now, but it can be ameliorated by using the ACT diagram, the hexaflex, and going through the different principles of ACT to work on how you can get more clarity, right? So that's the first condition of flow. The second condition of flow is the clear and immediate feedback. What would get in the way of getting a clear and immediate feedback? Well, this would be cognitive fusion, because we are always getting feedback. So it's not a matter of you not getting the feedback, it's a matter of you not being able to receive that feedback. And why wouldn't you be able to receive that feedback? Because it has such a negative valence emotionally that you just can't take it, right? In our society, words like failure, loser, wrong, messed up, effed up, all of these words and phrases are so loaded that they overwhelm people, and then they just stop trying. They just shut down, they just move on, they just don't even go in that direction anymore, right? So this is one thing that gets in the way of us being able to take in the feedback and then move towards the flow, because of all the negative judgment. And in fact, there's been some interesting research by Carol Dvorak at Stanford about how much better it is for us to receive praise for intelligence as performance versus praise for intelligence as a trait. And that's because if we see our intelligence as performance, that is, if we see our performing in any particular task as dependent on that specific performance, as opposed to dependent upon or indicative of our underlying intelligence as a permanent trait, we are going to be much more risk averse and therefore more stagnating in terms of our learning abilities when we see ourselves as smart as this permanent trait. You are smart, permanent trait, right? It becomes this, you begin to protect around it, and ironically, what that does is it makes you less smart because you're not willing to take risks because you're afraid of looking stupid. You hold on to this label of I'm smart, I'm intelligent, so much that you're afraid to ever look the opposite of that, and therefore you don't learn as much because learning is through trial and error, and all mistakes are is just negative information, and then you recalibrate your trajectory. But we have such an emotionally negative context to negative information that this is what happens, right? So there's stagnation in terms of our ability to be more intelligent. And I would even say that this praising for things as permanent traits as opposed to praising them as types of performance also is something that women have to deal with, girls and women have to deal with in terms of beauty. And it's an interesting thing if you think of beauty as a permanent trait, and then it becomes this protective thing and a sort of fragile thing, and then it sort of constricts one's movement in terms of, I can't do that because people will think it's not it's not something that someone pretty would do, or people think I'm ugly. Whereas if you think of prettiness as a performative thing, then it sort of takes it out of this whole sort of fragile process and creates more empowerment, and it also pulls back the curtain on the whole thing, and it can be a gender equalizer, and with the idea that anyone can be in drag, that the truth is that with enough makeup anyone can look beautiful, and without makeup anyone just looks plain, male or female, right? And so when we begin to see these qualities as performative rather than trait, it can be very helpful. So looking at the third parameter for flow, which is confidence. Confidence in one's ability, being able to balance between your skillfulness and the challenge of the task. What could get in the way of that, right? Well, studies show that we do best when there's a certain level of challenge, like that Goldilocks balance, right? Not too hot, not too cold, not too firm, not too soft, right? That's where we're going to do our best, right? And if we haven't assessed all of our abilities and we have an unrealistic goal, that can be one way that, that confidence meter is off, right? So really being able to look at ourselves more clearly in terms of our abilities, not experientially avoid the fact that maybe our abilities are not as high as we may think. And that's actually, that's how we're going to actually get our abilities to be of the level that we hope it would be, is by acknowledging where they are now so that we can move towards where we want to be. If instead we avoid acknowledging where our abilities are now, then we'll just stay stuck there, right? So these are some of the aspects of the flow state I just wanted to talk about. And in my next lecture, I'm going to talk about how the ACT hexaflex can help you reach the flow state in terms of all these different parameters. So this was just an introductory talk about the dialectical perspective, some aspects of mindfulness, including metacognition and the acceptance and commitment therapy model of fusion, cognitive diffusion, experiential avoidance, non-avoidance, self as context, present moment awareness, values exploration, and committed action. And I'll diagram that out and explain that in more depth next time. So thank you for your attention.